Stock market crash, depression, and the New Deal. Some major consequences of the crash, which your textbook listed some of them, but here are a few more. There was financial and psychological shock that swept across the nation. There was $140 billion in deposits that were totally wiped out. People lost their entire life savings. Millionaires who had millions of dollars in the bank lost it all. There was widespread unemployment. The banks had to close. Many families faced foreclosures on their homes because the dads were out of work. They had lost their jobs. They had lost all their savings in the bank. Despair and suicide crept across the nation. There were millionaires who couldn't face such loss, and they took their own lives. Some of them jumped from the top story of the skyscrapers of that day. Here are some images. A family who had lost their home and were living on the side of the road out of their vehicle. These are men, many of them professionals, manufacturer owners, business owners, industrialists, professionals that have lost their jobs, lost their incomes, their money, and they're having to stand in line in bread lines, soup lines, just to eat, just to survive. Another family that's been evicted from their home because they couldn't make their payments, and all of their possessions were left on the side of the street. Some specific consequences. U.S. Steel, their stocks dropped by 92%. Same with General Motors. Their stocks dropped 92%. 5,000 banks failed. Totally failed. Had to close their doors. This is before FDIC. There were no measures in place to protect people's deposits of money. 86,000 businesses closed their doors for good. The United States GNP fell from $104 billion to $41 billion. In 1932 alone, over 273,000 families were evicted from their homes. There were many automobile manufacturers that their businesses, their manufacturing totally failed, and they would disappear, never to be seen again, as I have some images on the next slide. There was the Stutz automobile. That's what this is, a very small automobile. The Rockney, you could buy for $585. This was supposed to have been Ford's only competition for low-priced automobiles. The Duesenberg totally disappeared. The Pierce Arrow, the Locomobile. Those were car manufacturers that were doing a big business during the 20s. Remember that era of apparent prosperity? But after the stock market crash, they totally go under. American society faced depression. Millions were unemployed, and neither local nor state agencies could handle the high demand. Churches, charities that normally took care of the poor, they couldn't handle the extreme numbers of those that were in despair. Many families take to the road, as we can see from this image, lost their car as well as their home, and they're walking, hoping to find work somewhere. Small farmers and tenant farmers become migrant workers. That is, they lose their land and they end up working during harvest season for those who are still producing. Urban and rural families suffer homelessness and malnutrition. Those many of the people who were well off, who were middle class, find themselves among the poor and the destitute. A church that is attempting to feed the hungry, and if you're last in line, your chances of getting anything to eat go way down. Example of children who have lost both parents, end up living on the street alone. And a family who has thrown up a makeshift tent as some kind of shelter. Probably the social class that felt the greatest impact from this Great Depression were the middle class families, those who had been not rich, but well-to-do and enjoying all the prosperity of the 20s, all those electric appliances, the automobile, the fashions. They lose all that. Rural families who were more accustomed to hardships and making do, although they suffered, they are more accustomed to that kind of lifestyle of making do. During this time, marriage and birth rates decline in the middle class because they don't want to start a family. Many young couples don't want to start a family because of the dire outlook for the future. There were many informal breakups of families. Husbands who can't take the humiliation of having to stand in food lines to get food for his family. They just walk off. They walk off and leave their families to do the best they can. Consumer habits, of course, change. All of those consumer goods that were produced during the 20s, people aren't able to buy them. Many women in the middle class take in laundry to make a little money, or they rent out rooms to boarders. If they have been privileged to have a home that they own, but so they have a home, they're not going to be homeless, but in order to survive for food, they will do things like the women taking in laundry for others, renting rooms out to boarders, or baking and selling baked goods. Here's another image of men standing in line at a soup kitchen. Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. Chamber of Commerce of one town put up a billboard saying, "Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own." Some of the portrayals of the suffering comes about through literature, such as Roy Stryker and Dorothea Lange take pictures of the Depression, of the effects of the Depression, and the impact on families. Erskine Caldwell and James Agee write about the Depression in the South. Richard Wright writes about the Depression and its effect in the urban ghettos. James Farrell writes about the lower class white youths. It was during this time period that many young men would take to the rails. They would jump onto the rail cars and ride to the next town or the next state trying to find work. My dad was 10 years old, and he was one of a family of 10 children. And he left home at the age of 10 and rode the rails. It was called riding the rails, looking for work. And any kind of work that he could get, then he would send money back to his family. And James Farrell writes about that kind of thing. John Steinbeck, of course, wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Here's a front page of the book. One, there are several different illustrations on the cover of the books that he produced. Grapes of Wrath, telling all about those people who left Oklahoma and made their way to California, again trying to find work. California fruit growers would send out leaflets, flyers to Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, offering work, plenty of work. Just come to California, we'll put you to work. So the Grapes of Wrath talks about families who leave everything behind and make their way to California. And again, my grandparents were in that group that was part of that migrating from Oklahoma to California. Here's the text cover of the book that Dorothea Lange produced. It was a photographic journal. Many of the images that you see, if you were to Google the Depression, many of the pictures you see would be pictures that Dorothea Lange took. In fact, this image is one that one of the most famous ones that Dorothea Lange took. And her book, actually T.H. Watkins, T.H. Watkins used Dorothea Lange's image to put on the cover of his book called The Hunger Years. And this has been published just recently about the Depression. Black Americans were affected to a greater degree than most whites. Intimidation and violence drive blacks from the job. So blacks who are working, they're going to be forced to quit because of threats of violence. Here is a Black American with the sign said, "We Negro men carried guns for Uncle Sam," and I'm sorry, I can't read it. Shouldn't we be able to work? and it's actually, the sign is for one particular company that was firing black veterans. Relief, any relief that was offered would go to whites before blacks. Some blacks travel south. There are others who were from the south that would travel north in hopes of finding better situations. During this time period, the NAACP made some gains for blacks in labor. So there were some gains made, but they were few and far between. Hispanics experienced some of the similar things to black Americans. Many, in fact, would leave, even though they were born in the United States, they would leave for Mexico, even though they had never been in Mexico in their life, because they were Hispanic. They would take their chances in Mexico. This is the headlines of one of the papers in the United States. Trainload of Mexicans will leave for homeland tonight. 4 trucks carry Larimer County Mexicans to Denver today, and then they will go from there on to Mexico. Women during the 30s, even those who before would hire women, during the 20s, when the men were off fighting in Europe, the women went to work. They worked in the factories. They took the men's place. But now that the war is over and the men are back home, all available work would go to the men. It was the idea that men were the breadwinners. And so any work should go to the men because they were the ones that were going to provide for their families. Women professionals who had gained ground during the 20s are going to face limited opportunities. Clerical work would remain open because the men didn't want those jobs. So any women who could find work would be in clerical or domestic jobs. But in that regard, black women were more likely to work than white women. So here we have 2 contrasting images that both took place during the 30s, during the Depression. These are women who believed that a woman's place was in the home, or that they were single women and believed that married women should be let go, should be laid off, and those jobs should go to single women who did not have a man to provide for. Thousands of single women need jobs. Fire married women. But in this one, these are women who are asking for jobs. Look, these are well-to-do women. They're wearing coats with fur on them. Said, we are denied a living. Jobs should be for all Americans. So they are protesting businesses that refuse to hire women. Herbert Hoover was president when the stock market crashed. His theory of dealing with the Depression was what he called volunteerism. He urged business leaders to maintain wages and production, to not cut back on required wages, or to slow down production. And he urged labor leaders to forego demands for better wages, better working conditions. Now, this is what he wanted, what he believed that they would do, they should do. But of course, that didn't happen. Hoover also raised the agricultural tariff. He raised taxes, the largest peacetime increase in tariffs in the history of the United States. He loaned money to banks, railroad companies, and insurance companies. And his idea behind that was that that was the way to revive the economy. But of course, his theories, his ideas didn't work. And in fact, many of the homeless who built up shanty towns called them Hoovervilles. And they blamed Hoover for the economic downturn, the economic crash. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, and he promised a New Deal to the people. The first 100 days of his presidency, March the 9th through June 16th, he had a special session of Congress to pass a series of laws dealing with the banking crisis. One, I think, remarkable thing about FDR was that he didn't try to come up with all the decisions himself, but he created what was called his brain trust. He gathered together a group of men and women to help him consider the situation and consider plans and alternative plans. In his brain trust, he had social, economic, and political thinkers come together, such as Harry Hopkins, who had been a director of relief programs, Henry Morgenthau, who had been an editor of a farm journal, and he owned a farm himself. Also, he was a German-born Jew. Frances Perkins, who would be the first woman to take a position in a president's cabinet. She had been a workers' rights advocate. Rexford Tugwell was an economist. So these are just a few of the people that he gathered to consider these world-shaking circumstances and to try to come up with plans. FDR was a Democrat, but he was not a hardline Democrat. In fact, he put aside political platform and theories and was willing to try whatever would work. He was not doctrinaire. He instituted what he called fireside chats. His famous words, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And while some people think that is doesn't really say anything, it really did, because fear of the unknown can cause people to have despair and commit suicide. So he's saying, let's have hope. Fear's not what we want to be feeling. March the 12th, 1933 was the first broadcast, and FDR talked to the people over these broadcasts like he was sitting down in your living room just talking to you, to your family. And as we can see from some of these images, when it was time for his fireside chats, people gathered around the radios, families, grandparents, parents, children, all gathered around to hear what FDR would say. It was through these fireside chats that he was able to build public confidence. He explained various New Deal projects, telling the American people there's hope, there's ways that we can come through this. He was the first president to make regular use of the radio. Roosevelt's cabinet, Henry Morgenthau became Secretary of the Treasury. He was a Republican. Henry Wallace became Secretary of Agriculture. Harold Ickes was the Secretary of the Interior, and Francis Perkins was Secretary of Labor. And he would gather his brain trust, his cabinet members, and they would sit down and consider options and plans. Franklin's idea was to bring, first of all, relief, then plans for recovery, and plans for reform to prevent the same thing from happening again. So first of all, he wanted to provide immediate help to the poor and the unemployed. He wanted to help bring businesses back from bankruptcy. He had long-range changes in mind to prevent future calamities. The CWA was a civil works administration that was meant to provide temporary work relief for over 4 million unemployed men. The CWA was meant to be short-lived. It was to get the unemployed, get people through the winter of 1932-33. Then the PWA was the Public Works Administration, where the government would begin projects that would be funded by the public-funded projects to create jobs. WPA, Works Project Administration, was different but the same, providing work. The AAA plan was to help farmers. A lot of times farmers would have crops in their field that were ready to harvest, but they couldn't afford to harvest them, and they couldn't afford to get them to market, to get their crops to market. So a lot of the farmers were watching their crops just wither and die in the field. But the AAA plan was to help farmers. The first AAA would eventually be considered by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. But then Roosevelt and his brain trust and his cabinet members came up with a second AAA that was not considered unconstitutional, but it was, again, to help the farmers. Civil Conservation Corps, the CCCs, provided jobs that would give employment for young men. Now, part of this was the idea that putting these young men to work and giving them wages that would help their families, but also to keep them off the streets and out of trouble. Mention my own family again. My dad was part of the CCCs. He had a job. They lived in Oklahoma, but he worked with the CCCs in New Mexico and Texas, digging irrigation ditches and building bridges across farm roads. So most, at least from his stories that I've heard, it was in the rural areas that they put the young men to work. And here's an image of a truckload of young men that were part of the CCCs being taken to a job site. AAA Cotton Office, a couple of farmers sitting here reading the notices. Work pays America. WPA was to, and this is the WPA, was to provide long-term government jobs. So while the PWA public-funded projects to build like libraries, county and town projects like parks, recreation areas in a county or a state. The WPA was for long-term government jobs, big jobs that would take more than a year or two to complete. Things that were needed, projects creating things that the country needed, but being government funded and providing jobs for the unemployed. They didn't forget the Native Americans. They passed the IRA, the Indian Resource Administration, Reorganization, I'm sorry, Indian Reorganization Act that reorganized the oh great, hang on a second, I've lost my train of thought. Reservation, reorganizing the reservations, getting Native Americans off the reservations into private homes. So attempts to assist people. These were all attempts, programs to help people. The legacy of the New Deal was that it established a safety net for various groups. Also something, I haven't mentioned the reform programs, like the FDA was formed, federal insurance deposit, insurance on deposits anyway, federal deposit insurance was one of the reforms. Social Security was created during the 30s under Roosevelt's administration as a means of helping the elderly and the poor. Several others that totally skipped my mind right now, but read your textbook. They're in there. So establishing a safety net for various groups was part of the legacy, making a more humane industrial society, because under Roosevelt's New Deal, manufacturers, industrial owners were regulated to provide good working conditions, hours, wages. The economy was stabilized. It created a basis for new forms of federal fiscal policy. Part of the reform was in regulating the stock market. Practices of modern corporate life became subject to federal regulation. Blacks reaped limited benefits under the New Deal. Women made some gains. So I want to talk about another aspect of the 30s that created perhaps as much depression, destitution that the Great Depression itself did, and that was the Dust Bowl. Millions and millions of tons of earth were blown across the country. This is an image of a Texas dust storm. Huge black clouds of dust that would cover towns, destroying things in its wake. Many homes, if their windows, their doors weren't sealed in good, the dirt would seep into their homes and cause many to get sick because of breathing all that dust. This is a Colorado dust storm, 1935, covering an entire city or town. One of South Dakota's black blizzards. This is dirt. In the wintertime, it would cover cities. This would happen during the day, and it would totally block out the sun until it would turn the huge area just dark within seconds as these dust storms would blow across the country. This is a dust storm near Beaver, Oklahoma. I read today in a science journal that, and I'm sorry I didn't make notes, but there was a man who, environmentalist, and he studied, he was part of the soil conservation group, and he estimated how many thousands of acres of topsoil were lost during this dust storm that would blow across the United States. Even in Washington, D.C., they experienced these dust storms, blowing dirt from Oklahoma and Kansas all the way across the nation. The title of the article was "The Man Who Saved the United States." It was because of his plans that he took before the Senate, and as I read today, the very time he was in front of the Senate, a dust storm blew across Washington, D.C., and it served as an example of what he was talking about. I remember my grandparents talking about my grandmother would, every morning when she'd get up, she would have to sweep all the dust out of the house that had come through around the door and around the windows, and a lot of times having to shovel the accumulated dirt out of their doorway and the front of their house. Thousands of head of cattle died because of the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl included the states Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado specifically, but also, as we saw, it even went as far north as the Dakotas. So, a depressing story of a Great Depression. Next time we hope that we have a little better story. Until then.